Her stepmother dragged her to the auction, but one man raised his hand to save her, and now.
Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from.
The wagon came in just after noon. Dust clung to the wheels. The mule, thin and patchy, moved at a tired pace down the main stretch of town. Flies hovered around its flanks. The sun was high, bright, sharp, unforgiving. Not the kind of heat that made people relax, but the kind that kept everyone squinting and sweating, shadows sharp beneath their hats. People were already waiting. Word had gotten out earlier that morning. Another woman was being put up on the block. A domestic indenture auction, legal by territorial law, though everyone knew it was a thin excuse. Another way for desperate men to get women cheap, paperwork or not. The wagon rattled to a stop in front of the platform by the old courthouse wall. The woman sitting in the back didn't move at first. Her name was Clara Dane, 22. Her hair was long, dark brown, unbrushed. It clung to her damp skin and stuck against the back of her neck. She wore a faded floral dress that looked like it had once belonged to someone else. Too snug in places, the skirt wrinkled, the collar torn where the fabric had given under strain. There was a sweat stain across the bust and a raw, stretched neckline that exposed the top curve of her chest, and she knew exactly what it looked like. She sat still anyway. Next to her, a woman jumped down, tall, lean, sharp-featured. Her stepmother, Mrs. Harlan, had gray streaks in her black hair and lines carved in her face that looked more like bitterness than age. She didn't speak to Clara. She just reached up, grabbed her by the wrist, and yanked her down hard enough to make her stumble in the dirt. "Stand straight," the woman snapped under her breath, already turning to the man with the auction sheet. Clara did. She adjusted her footing. Her hands shook a little, but her back stayed straight. She didn't look at the crowd, just past them, as if she was trying to see through them. Her mouth was set. She said nothing. Inside her chest, her heart was running fast. She didn't want to cry. Crying in front of them would make it worse. She didn't know what they'd call it, weakness, invitation, both, but it wouldn't help. She wanted to disappear, but disappearing wasn't an option. The man running the auction stepped up. Mid-50s, dirty vest, greasy hat. He held a ledger under one arm and waved a piece of paper like it made things official. "This here's Clara Dane," he said, signed over by her legal guardian. "No debts, fit for household duties, no children, contract for a full term of service. Buyer assumes full responsibility. Standard terms apply." It sounded clean, professional, but Clara could feel their eyes. They weren't listening to the words. They were looking at her, at the way her dress clung to her hips, the tear in the neckline, the curve of her breasts where the fabric sagged from wear. She wanted to cover herself. She didn't. Someone snorted. "I'll give a sack of cornmeal," a voice called from the back. Laughter followed. Another said, "2 bottles of red eye, long as she can pour." A few more offers came. No one looked her in the face. They talked to the auctioneer like she was a piece of equipment. Her throat was dry. She didn't move. Then a man at the edge of the crowd moved. Elias Boone, 41, was tall, broad across the chest, and still carried himself like a soldier. He had sun-worn skin, a trimmed but rough beard, and a face that didn't show much. He wore a faded blue Union Army coat, even in the heat, open at the front, with a flannel shirt beneath it and a brass buckle that still bore the eagle insignia. His trousers were dust-covered. The hat on his head had seen better days. He'd come to town for supplies. That was all. Feed, lamp oil, salt. He didn't need company. Didn't want it. He hadn't spoken much since his wife died 4 winters back from fever that moved too fast to stop. Since then, he'd lived alone up near Ridge Hollow, just past the second bluff, working the land, fixing the barn, keeping to himself. But he'd heard the noise in the square and followed it out of reflex. He hadn't meant to stay. Then he saw her. He couldn't say what stopped him exactly. Maybe it was the way she stood still. Maybe it was how she didn't beg, didn't fight, didn't even argue. That kind of stillness only came from someone who'd been cornered before. He knew what it looked like. He'd worn it himself. The bids were still going. Someone said $5 and a half-spent bottle of molasses. Elias didn't speak. He just stepped forward and raised his hand. The square went quiet. The auctioneer blinked. "You offering something, Mr. Boone?" 30, Elias said plainly. Nobody spoke for a second. Then the stepmother, sharp as ever, said, "Done." She grabbed the money as fast as it left his hand, without even looking at Clara. Clara didn't move when the deal was sealed. She waited. One of the men gave her a nudge from behind. She took a single step forward, and Elias was already standing there. He didn't touch her. He just held out his hand, palm up. Not a command, not a pull, just an offer. She looked at it. She thought about it. Her stomach twisted. She didn't take it, but she stepped down and walked beside him anyway. They crossed the square without a word. He didn't look at her dress. He didn't speak to the men watching. He didn't even glance at the stepmother, who was already halfway into the saloon with her payment. Clara kept pace with him. Her legs felt unsteady, but she stayed upright. She wasn't sure what had just happened. She didn't know if this was better or worse. He hadn't looked at her like the others. That counted for something. But she learned not to trust what people didn't say. Silence could hold all kinds of danger too. He helped her into the wagon without touching her skin, just steadying the edge of the seat. They turned the mule toward the hills and rode in silence. She didn't know his name. He hadn't asked hers. The road stretched ahead, dusty, quiet, nothing familiar. She didn't cry. She kept her hands in her lap. Her torn dress shifted with each bounce. She didn't try to fix it anymore. What was the point? But when she glanced sideways and saw him keeping both hands on the reins, his face expressionless but calm, she felt something shift in her chest. Not safety, not trust, but maybe space. And that was more than anyone had given her in a long time. The road away from town stretched long and dry. Wind stirred loose grit across the wagon bed, and the mule kept on without being urged, its ears twitching against the buzz of flies. The wagon creaked under its own weight, and neither of them spoke. Elias kept both hands on the reins, elbows resting on his knees. Clara sat with her hands folded in her lap, eyes scanning the land ahead. She had expected him to talk, or worse, to leer. She was used to that. Men always filled silence with something, orders, jokes, threats. But Elias Boone said nothing. He hadn't since they left the square. His quiet unsettled her, but it wasn't sharp. It didn't feel like it was waiting to snap. Still, she stayed alert. Her eyes drifted to his belt, the worn Union buckle, and then to his hands, broad and scarred from years of labor. He didn't fidget, didn't glance her way, just stared ahead, slow blinking, jaw set like stone. She finally spoke low. "Where are we going?" "North Ridge," he said without turning. "My land's out past the hollow. Cabin, barn, stock." She nodded but didn't reply. The silence came back, but it wasn't quite the same anymore. They rode like that for hours, up through pine country, where the air cooled and the wind smelled of sap. The mule slowed on the incline, and Elias didn't push it. Clara took in the terrain, noticing how far the land spread with no fences, no signs of town life. It wasn't empty, but it was quiet, unwatched. A part of her still didn't believe she wasn't being taken somewhere worse. As the sun started to tip west, Elias pointed ahead. There! The wagon cleared a rise, and down in the valley sat a small cabin tucked near a cluster of trees. One story, sloped roof, a fenced garden long gone to weeds, smokehouse, corral with 2 horses and a row of rail fencing, stacks of firewood, everything built by hand, rough but solid. He stopped the wagon near the barn and stepped down, slow. Then he turned and held the edge steady for her. Still no hand reaching, still giving her space. Clara climbed down, her legs stiff from the ride. She looked at the cabin, then at him. "Is it just you?" "Been that way a while," he said. She nodded again. He walked to the cabin, opened the door, then waited. She hesitated, then followed him inside. The main room smelled faintly of cedar and ash. There was a stove in the corner, a table with 2 chairs, shelves lined with canned goods and tools. A rifle rested above the door. A single bed sat against the far wall with a quilt neatly folded. To the left, a door led to a smaller room. He gestured. "That one's yours." She stepped inside the second room. There was a narrow cot, a wash basin, a folded blanket. Clean, sparse, no sign of anyone else ever using it. "I'll fix supper," he said behind her. Water's in the barrel out back, if you want to wash up." She turned to look at him. His voice was deep but soft-spoken, like it had worn down over time. His eyes didn't move below her shoulders. "I ain't expecting anything from you," he added, watching her face closely. "You sleep. You eat. That's all for now." Clara didn't answer. She just nodded once and closed the door behind her. Inside, she stared at the cot. Her hands trembled slightly as she removed the ruined moccasins. Then the dress. She washed slow, dipping cloth into the basin, wiping dirt from her arms, her collarbone, the hollow of her throat. The tear in the neckline gaped more now that the fabric was loose. She had no other clothes. Folded on the end of the bed was a clean flannel shirt, too large, obviously his. She picked it up, holding the weight of it in her hands for a moment before slipping it on. It covered her better than the dress. She breathed a little easier. In the other room, she heard the clink of metal, a pan over flame, the scrape of a knife. By the time she stepped out, hair damp, Elias was at the stove stirring something in a pot. He'd changed out of his coat. His sleeves were rolled to the elbows, forearms marked by old burns and scars. He didn't look up when she entered. "Stool be ready soon," he said. Clara sat down quietly at the table. He set a tin plate in front of her and poured her a ladleful before serving himself. She watched him while he worked. Every movement was steady, without rush or show. He didn't try to talk while they ate. She took her first bite. It was hot, salty, simple, better than anything she'd had in days. "Why'd you do it?" she asked suddenly. Elias paused mid-chew, then swallowed, set his spoon down. "They were treating you like a thing," he said. "Didn't sit right. You don't even know me. Didn't need to." Clara looked down at her bowl. The food blurred for a second before her eyes cleared again. "Not everyone would have done that," she said. "I know," he replied. They finished the meal in silence. Afterward, he stood and began cleaning the dishes without a word. She helped. He didn't ask her to. The sun dipped lower behind the ridge. The light in the cabin turned gold, then blue. Shadows stretched across the floor. He lit a single oil lamp and set it near her door. "If you need anything, I'll be up early." Barn's the first stop. She hesitated in the doorway of her room. Her hand brushed the frame. She looked back at him. "Thank you." Elias gave a small nod. "Get some rest." She closed the door behind her. Alone in the small room, wearing his shirt, wrapped in his silence, Clara lay down on the cot. She listened to the night sounds, the creak of wood, the whistle of wind through the chinks, the soft knock of his boots moving across the floor before the cabin settled. It wasn't home. Not yet. But it wasn't the square. And he hadn't touched her. She stared up at the ceiling and tried to let her breathing slow. It wasn't over. But for now, she was safe. And that was something. Morning came cold. The kind of cold that settled into the cracks of the cabin floor and made the stove groan as the heat from the coals struggled to hold its own. Clara opened her eyes slowly, unsure where she was for a few seconds. The unfamiliar ceiling. The rough wool blanket tucked to her chest. The faint scent of cedar, smoke still in the air. Then it came back to her. Yesterday, the auction, the wagon ride, the man named Elias Boone. She sat up quietly, listening. No voices. No footsteps. The shirt he'd given her the night before was still on her, soft, heavy, clean. She pulled her dress over it, wincing slightly as the torn collar dragged against her shoulder. She didn't want to wear it again, but it was all she had. For now, she opened the door and stepped into the main room. The fire had been tended. Coals glowed in the stove, and the kettle steamed gently, half full. The table had 2 tin mugs already set out. Elias was gone. She crossed to the window. The frost on the outside had started to melt, catching the light. She could see the corral now, in movement. Elias walking across the frozen yard with a pitchfork in hand, coat pulled tight, head bent into the wind. He didn't know she was watching. For a moment, she didn't move. She just watched the way he worked. No wasted motion, no hesitation. He checked the barn, then unlatched the gate for the horses. They trusted him. She could see that from here. No whip, no shouting, just habit, repetition. That kind of calm didn't come from charm or education. It came from years of being alone. She poured 2 mugs of coffee. When he came in, he stomped the dirt from his boots outside first, then stepped through the door with a slight nod toward her. He looked surprised the coffee was ready but didn't say anything. Just unbuttoned his coat and hung it near the door. His flannel shirt underneath was faded and patched at the elbows, sleeves rolled to the wrist. His hair was still damp near the edges, probably from the water trough. His face looked sharper in the morning light, older, maybe, but not harsh. Clara pushed one mug toward him. "You didn't have to start without me," she said quietly. "You were sleeping," he replied. "Didn't want to wake you." He sat down and drank, both hands around the cup. They sat like that for a long minute. Then he asked, "You ever worked stock before?" She shook her head. "No, only cleaning. Some cooking, sewing." "All right," he said. "You'll pick it up. I can show you." She waited for him to ask what she expected most men to ask. What she could offer, what she was good for. But it never came. He sipped his coffee and set the cup down. "I'll mend that dress today," he added. She glanced at him, unsure. He kept his eyes level. "You don't have to keep wearing it torn." A pause. She nodded. After breakfast, he showed her around the property. The cabin sat in the crook of a shallow valley, ringed by pine and low bluffs. The smokehouse stood 50 feet out, a henhouse next to it, empty for now. The barn held tools and a milk cow. 2 horses. Tackle. Feed. She noticed everything was organized. Simple but cared for. "You built this yourself?" she asked, breaking a stretch of silence. Elias nodded. "After the war. Took time." She didn't press. But the question people in town had whispered, why a man like him lived alone out here, was starting to answer itself. After the barn, he showed her the shed behind the house, where the mending tools were. She followed him in. The inside was warmer than expected, packed tight with supplies. He reached into a crate and pulled out a needle kit and a scrap of matching fabric. Sat down on the bench. "You don't have to fix it," she said, watching him thread the needle. "I don't mind." He worked slow, steady. No words, just the sound of the thread pulling clean. Clara sat nearby on an overturned crate, arms folded, watching his hands. She thought back to all the men who had grabbed at her clothes, the ones who tore fabric and expected her to thank them for it. Now a man was sewing that same tear closed without a word. That did something strange in her chest. When he finished, he handed it to her, eyes never dropping below her collarbone. She took it carefully. "Thank you," she said. He nodded. "Supper's around 5. I'll be out back if you need anything." She went back inside, holding the dress like it was something new again. She hadn't been given anything in a long time without a price behind it. And though she hadn't known exactly what to expect from this man, this ranch, this deal, she hadn't expected respect. Later that afternoon, she cleaned the hearth, then the floor, then the shelves. Not because he told her to, but because she needed to do something. She needed to feel useful again, like she belonged here in some way, even if she didn't yet believe it. Elias came in before dusk. They cooked together, potatoes, salt pork, leftover stew. She moved beside him at the stove without thinking about it. At the table, he finally asked her something that wasn't practical. "What was your home like?" She looked at him for a long moment, then shrugged. "Didn't have one for a while. Father died when I was 16. He was good to me. After that, just a roof over my head and someone waiting to sell it from under me." Elias didn't say sorry. He just listened. "I was never asked what I wanted," she added, voice lower. "Just told what I was worth." He looked at her then. Not pity, just quiet recognition. "You're not property here." She held his gaze for a few seconds, then looked away. "I don't know what I am here yet." "That's all right," he said. "You'll figure it out." That night, she stood outside the cabin for a moment before bed, pulling his flannel tighter around her shoulders. The stars were sharp in the sky. The wind pushed lightly through the trees, not harsh, just steady. She could hear the mule shuffling in the barn, the creak of wood somewhere far off. Inside, he'd left the lamp burning near her door again. She stepped in and closed it behind her. She still didn't feel safe, but she didn't feel hunted either. And that was a start. The days began to follow a rhythm. Elias rose at first light, stoked the fire, checked the animals. Clara woke soon after, dressing in layers against the cold and pulling her hair back into a simple braid. She never had to ask what needed doing. There was always something, and Elias didn't hover. He showed her once, and then let her take over. She fed the chickens, learned how to split kindling, scrubbed clothes against a washboard until her fingers numbed. It was hard work, but honest, and no one yelled if it wasn't perfect. They rarely spoke unless it was needed, but the silence between them had changed. It wasn't tense now. It was space, room to breathe, room to observe each other. It had been 4 days since the auction. Clara still hadn't fully unpacked her things. Not that she had many, but she had started folding his shirt neatly at the end of her cot each morning, and he hadn't asked for it back. When she wore it over her dress in the cold, he never commented. That alone said something. On the 5th evening, a storm rolled in low from the south. Dark clouds swallowed the sky, and the wind kicked up dry needles from the pine trees until they skittered across the porch like claws. By dusk, snow had started to fall, thick and quiet. Elias double-checked the barn before nightfall, while Clara pulled extra wood inside. They ate by lantern light that night. Potato soup and beans. Simple but warm. Midway through the meal, Clara asked him, "You ever have family here?" Elias didn't answer right away. He finished his bite, then set his spoon down and looked at the fire. "Wife," he said. "Few years." She passed. Clara didn't press, but something tightened behind her ribs. Not from jealousy, just understanding. A lot of silence made more sense now. "How long ago?" she asked quietly. "4 winters." He didn't say her name. He didn't explain what happened, but his shoulders shifted like he was carrying something with weight. She nodded and didn't ask anything more. He seemed to appreciate that. After dinner, she cleaned the dishes. He dried. Then, without a word, he took the mended dress she'd worn the past few days and placed it on the table. The fabric near the neckline had been reinforced with new stitching. Neat, small, exact. "I had some time," he said, almost awkwardly. "Used fabric from the sackcloth." She ran her hand over it, fingertips brushing the thread. "It's good work," she said. "Better than anything I've done." Elias shrugged. "Had to fix a lot in the army." That night, the wind howled louder. The cabin creaked in its joints, and snow hit the windows like thrown sand. Clara lay in her cot, wrapped in the blanket, arms tucked tight to her chest. But she couldn't sleep, not because of the cold, but because of something else. She didn't feel afraid of him anymore. That had faded. What she felt now was different. Slower, heavier, a weight in her chest every time he did something without asking for thanks. Every time he looked at her like she was a person, not a burden or a favor owed. She had told herself she didn't need anyone, that she was safer that way. But safety wasn't the same as comfort. And tonight, in the dark, she realized she didn't want to feel alone in the walls of this place. She rose quietly, wrapping the flannel around her shoulders, and stepped out of her room barefoot, slow. The fire had gone down to embers, casting a low red light across the main room. Elias was sitting in his chair beside the hearth, sharpening a tool by lamplight. He looked up when she stepped forward. "Can't sleep?" he asked. She shook her head. He set the blade down. "Too cold." "No," she said, then hesitated, just thinking. He didn't ask about what. She stepped closer. Her bare feet made no sound on the wood floor. He noticed and stood slightly, unsure if she needed something. "You don't owe me anything," he said quietly. "I know," she replied. They stood there in silence, only the wind howling beyond the walls and the soft crackle of firewood between them. Then she moved forward and, without asking, reached for his hand. He didn't flinch. He just let her. Her fingers brushed over the back of his hand. Rough, scarred, calloused, and she curled her own fingers around it. Not tight, just contact. He looked down at them, then at her, expression unreadable but open. She searched his face, steady. "I don't know what you expect from me," she said, "but I'm not broken, not beyond repair." "I don't expect anything," he said. She nodded once, as if that confirmed something she needed to hear out loud. Then, still holding his hand, she leaned forward and kissed him. It wasn't long. It wasn't practiced. It was warm, unhurried, and real. When she pulled back, he didn't say anything, but he didn't let go of her hand either. She gave it one last squeeze, then turned and walked back to her room. She slept deeper than she had in weeks. And when she woke the next morning to the scent of coffee already brewing and a plate warming on the stove, she didn't feel like a guest anymore. She felt like she had begun to belong. The snow stuck around for 3 more days. The land beyond the cabin turned white and quiet, with soft mounds of powder blanketing the fence lines and the barn roof. The trail leading into the trees vanished under it. Smoke curled from the chimney in a steady line, and the cabin stayed warm, thanks to the fire Elias kept going day and night. Inside, things moved slowly, coffee in the morning, quiet chores, meals cooked in silence that no longer felt strained. Clara found herself adjusting without realizing it. She started pulling her weight in more subtle ways. She noticed how he liked his coffee, strong, no sugar. She kept track of the pantry shelves, quietly noting what was running low. She mended one of his shirts without asking. Elias, for his part, left a second pair of wool socks folded near her cot one morning. He didn't say anything, just left them there. They didn't talk about the kiss, but something had shifted between them. The distance they kept before, out of caution, fear, grief, had lessened. They still didn't speak much, but their eyes met more. Their silences weren't about avoidance anymore. They were about comfort. One morning, after the snow had begun to melt, Elias came in from the barn and said, "We'll need to go into town tomorrow. Feed's low. Coffee too." Clara looked up from the table, where she was sewing another patch into her dress. Her hands paused mid-stitch. "Do I have to go?" she asked. His eyes stayed on her a second longer than usual. "You don't," he said, "but you can, if you want." She didn't answer right away. The truth was, she didn't want to be seen. Not by those men. Not by her stepmother. She hadn't forgotten the way they'd all looked at her in that square, like she was meat hanging in the sun. But part of her also didn't want to hide. She had been silent her whole life. And now, for the first time, she wasn't afraid of the man who shared her roof. That meant something. "I'll come," she said quietly. The next morning, the road into town was muddy but passable. The mule worked slow, the wagon wheels cutting into the slush and ruts. Clara wore her mended dress, layered with Elias's old coat that hung big on her frame, and the scarf he'd handed her before they left. She tucked her hands inside the sleeves to keep them warm. They passed 2 riders on the trail. One nodded at Elias. Neither said a word about Clara, but both gave her a second look. By the time they rolled into the edge of town, she felt it again, that old sensation of being seen too closely, like her skin didn't belong to her anymore. People stared. They always did. But this time, she was sitting beside someone who didn't look away. Elias tied the mule outside the mercantile and helped her down. He didn't touch her waist or her arm, just steadied the step with one hand near her back. It was enough. Inside, she stayed close, but not because she felt threatened. Just careful. The clerk behind the counter paused when they entered. "Boone," he said with a nod. "Need flour, salt, and a 50-pound sack of oats," Elias said plainly. "And 2 bars of lye." The man reached for his ledger, then his eyes drifted to Clara. He gave a small, knowing smirk. "That the girl from Harlan's auction?" Elias didn't answer right away. He picked up the tin scoop, dropped oats into a burlap sack. Clara's pulse quickened. She felt her cheeks burn. Her hands went cold inside her coat. "She yours now," the clerk added, grinning. Elias straightened up. He didn't raise his voice, didn't take a step forward. But when he looked up, his voice came steady, low. "She's under my roof. She eats at my table. She's not up for comment." The smirk faded. The clerk coughed once and went back to scribbling in the ledger. They paid and left without further word. Clara didn't speak until they were halfway back down the road, wagon creaking through mud and melting snow. "You didn't have to say anything," she said, not looking at him. "I don't let folks talk that way under my name," he replied. She nodded. She didn't thank him. He didn't expect her to. But when they got home and she was unloading the sack of flour, she paused, leaned slightly toward him, and said, "You made me feel like I wasn't small." He looked at her for a long second, then just said, "You're not." That night, the fire burned low and steady. He was sitting in his usual chair, a book in his lap, unread. She was across from him at the table, peeling apples they'd brought back from town. The wind outside had died down. There was no reason to speak. But when she stood to put the apples away and brushed his arm passing by, he didn't move. She rested her hand gently on his shoulder for a second longer than necessary. Not question, Not a promise, just presence. And that was enough for both of them for now. The next week brought a stretch of clear, dry days. Cold still clung to the mornings, but the snow had mostly melted off, leaving the valley damp and quiet, the ground soft underfoot. Patches of green started to show near the edges of the corral, and the creek at the far end of Elias's land ran louder with meltwater. Clara woke each morning before light and stayed up until the lamps flickered low. She didn't ask for rest, didn't speak of weariness, but Elias noticed the dark beneath her eyes. She worked too hard for someone with nothing to prove. But he understood it. He had done the same after his wife died, kept his hands busy so his mind didn't wander. They had fallen into a rhythm now, almost like clockwork. He worked the fence line. She swept, cooked, patched torn shirts, checked the chicken wire for gaps. She had started adding touches to the cabin, nothing loud, just small things. A pine bough over the windowsill, a folded cloth over the table, a dried flower she found tucked behind a nail on the wall. Elias didn't comment on them, but he noticed. One evening, after they'd eaten and cleaned up, he stepped into the barn to finish a repair on the saddle strap. When he came back in, the fire was crackling low, and Clara had moved her chair closer to it. She was barefoot, her dress hem resting just above her ankles, and the old flannel shirt of his still draped over her shoulders. She looked up when he entered. "You finish?" she asked. "Just about." He sat down across from her. The silence wasn't uncomfortable, but something hung in the space between them, unfinished. Then she asked, "Did your wife look like me?" Elias didn't answer right away. He rubbed his thumb over the callus on his palm. "No," he said, "not much." Clara gave a small nod. "Was she kind?" He thought about that, then said, "She was steady. Didn't say much. Stronger than me in most ways." She let the quiet linger before saying, "You loved her." "Still do." That answer didn't bother her. It settled something, actually. He wasn't pretending he'd never had a life before. He wasn't pretending she could replace anything. That made this, whatever this was, feel more honest. She shifted slightly, adjusting her feet beneath the chair. Her dress, though mended, still sat low at the neckline, and the lamp behind her cast a soft amber light across her skin. He noticed the curve of her collarbone, the bare slope above the fabric. But he didn't stare. He didn't speak. She looked at him then, eyes searching. "Do you want me?" she asked plainly. "Not for the work. Not for the silence." "Me." Elias leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. His voice came low, without hesitation. "Yes." Her breath caught, but she didn't look away. "Why haven't you touched me?" she asked, not accusing, just asking. "Because I'm not trying to earn anything I haven't been offered." Clara stood slowly, the firelight flickering behind her. She stepped around the table, stopping in front of him. She reached up and unbuttoned the flannel, then let it slip from her shoulders, revealing the top of her dress, the neckline dipping low, the curve of her cleavage visible, soft and real. The air in the room changed. She didn't speak. Elias stood too, slow, deliberate. He reached up and touched the side of her face, letting his hand rest gently near her ear, his thumb brushing over her jaw. She didn't flinch, didn't pull back. His other hand came to rest at her waist, not gripping, just holding. Then, with no words between them, he kissed her. It was not rushed, not hungry. It was warm, steady, firm. A long kiss, full of everything neither of them had said in days. She kissed him back. Her hand slid over his chest, feeling the steady rise and fall of his breathing, the rough cotton of his shirt beneath her fingers. He pulled her closer, letting her decide how close. And when she leaned into him fully, he wrapped both arms around her and held her like someone who had been waiting quietly, patiently, and now didn't want to let go. They stood like that for a long time. No rush, no expectations. Eventually, she pulled back just far enough to rest her forehead against his. "I've never done this by choice before," she whispered. "I want this to be mine." Elias's voice was quiet. "It is." She nodded. They moved together through the cabin slowly. No noise but the pop of the fire and the creak of wood beneath their steps. When she slipped the straps of her dress off her shoulders and let it fall, she did it in front of him without shame. Her body was soft, curved, full, marked by survival, not decoration. and Elias looked at her like she was not something owed, but something offered. He undressed with the same patience. No haste, no sharp movement. Just care. When they came together in the bed, it was quiet, real, and without any need for explanation. His touch was firm but gentle, hers responsive and trembling, not from fear, but from being seen. Fully. They didn't speak after. She lay curled beside him, her hand resting on his chest, his fingers tracing the curve of her spine onto the quilt. He stayed awake longer, listening to her breath slow into sleep. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like the silence in the room was loneliness. And for the first time in her life, Clara fell asleep warm, untouched by fear, and with no debt hanging over her. The fire in the hearth burned down low, but neither of them stirred. There was nothing left to prove, nothing left to earn. They had simply chosen each other. The morning after changed nothing and everything. Clara woke before the sun rose, the way she always did, but this time, she didn't rise from her cot. She was in Elias's bed, lying beneath a heavy quilt that smelled faintly of cedar and wool. One of his arms was still around her waist. Her head rested against his chest, and she could hear the slow, steady thump of his heart under her cheek. She lay still for a long moment, just breathing. There was no shame, no confusion, only warmth and a quiet sense of calm she hadn't known her body was capable of. It was the first time she had ever been touched without fear following close behind. She shifted slightly. Elias stirred. His hand at her waist flexed, but didn't pull her closer or push her away. "You all right?" he asked, voice rough from sleep. Clara nodded. "Yeah, I am." They stayed that way a little longer before she finally sat up and reached for the shirt he'd let her borrow before. She slipped it over her shoulders, then stood barefoot on the cold floor, crossing to the stove to stoke the fire. Elias watched her move, his eyes steady, respectful, and quiet. Nothing needed to be said. She was still her. He was still him. But something between them had settled, like a piece falling in a place that had always been missing. Over the next few days, their routines resumed, but with an ease neither of them had felt before. When Clara cooked, Elias came in to help without being asked. When he split wood, she handed him tools. They worked together without fuss, without needing to speak. She noticed the way he always left the last slice of bread for her, the way he refilled her coffee cup when she wasn't looking. He noticed how she folded his shirts tighter, how she started humming under her breath while sweeping, how she checked the barn latch twice at night without saying why. It wasn't romance in the dramatic sense. There were no declarations, no gifts, no grand moments. Just presence, a steady rhythm of choosing to stay. Still, questions lingered, ones neither had voiced yet. They hadn't talked about what they were now, about what people would assume, about what would come next. That changed the next time Elias suggested going to town. It was a bright day, cold but clear. He mentioned it over breakfast. Need seed for the coop. Nails too. Clara set down her cup. "We can both go," she said. He looked at her. "You sure?" She nodded. "I don't want to hide." She didn't say what she feared most, being looked at like she was a possession again. But Elias understood. He gave her a quiet nod, and that was that. This time, she wore the mended dress, now fully reinforced. Over it, Elias gave her his other coat, a cleaner one, lined inside. It was still too big, but she didn't mind. She rolled the sleeves and tied it at the waist. Her hair she left down, brushed, and loose across her shoulders. They rode into town in the wagon as they had before, but this time something felt different. People still looked, but no one dared say much. Elias's reputation carried weight. A man who'd fought at Antietam and buried a wife without complaint wasn't someone people chose to provoke. Still, as they stepped into the general store, Clara caught sight of her stepmother across the street. The woman stood near the saloon, talking to one of the ranch hands from the stockyard. She saw Clara, smiled, thin and bitter. Clara didn't look away. Inside the store, the clerk from before stiffened as they entered. His eyes darted between them. "Boone," he said, curt. Elias nodded. "Nails. Seed. 2 sacks flour." The man started writing it up. Then he looked at Clara. "Still under contract?" Clara lifted her chin. "I'm not under anything." The clerk hesitated, unsure how to respond. Elias spoke next. If anyone asks, she's my wife. That landed like a stone. Clara blinked. She turned to him. He didn't look at her. He was busy checking the feed prices scribbled on the board behind the counter. The clerk nodded slowly. All right then. The rest of the visit passed without trouble. They loaded the wagon. Clara stayed quiet until they were halfway back up the road. You didn't ask me, she said. Elias looked over at her. Would you have said no? She didn't answer right away. The wind picked up, pushing her hair across her face. No, she finally said, but I would have liked to know I had a choice. He nodded once. You still do. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, say it again. The way you said it. Elias glanced at her. What you told him. Say it again. He stared out at the trees ahead, jaw tightening slightly. She's my wife, he said. Clara looked down, her fingers curling around the fabric of his coat. Her voice came quieter. All right. That night, they ate stew by the fire. After, she reached for his hand without needing to ask. Later, as they lay in the same bed under the same quilt, with the fire slowly dying down, Elias rolled onto his side and brushed her hair back from her forehead. You still scared of me? He asked. Clara met his eyes. No, you trust me? She nodded. I never thought I'd have this again, he said. Not after her. Clara touched the scar that cut across the back of his hand, a small gesture that said she understood. You're not asking for the same thing, she said. Neither am I. Outside, the wind pushed softly through the trees, brushing against the shutters like breath. Inside, there were no more questions. Just two people who had stopped running from the world, from each other, and from their own pasts. They had chosen to stay, and neither of them wanted to be anywhere else. By late March, the last of the frost had given way to soft ground and cold rain. The ridge beyond the cabin turned from gray to green, and the creek behind the barn swelled with snowmelt. Life returned in quiet ways. Shoots pushing up through the garden beds Clara had cleared with her sleeves rolled and dirt under her nails. Hens laying again in the corners of the coop, and two calves born without complication. The land was changing, and so were they. Elias had started referring to things as ours. Not loudly, not deliberately, but as if it had always been true. We'll need to patch our fence. We'll ride into town to sell our grain. Clara never corrected him. In fact, she started doing the same without noticing. There was no proposal, no ring, but neither of them needed that. One morning, Clara came in from gathering eggs with her braid damp from mist and mud on her boots. Elias stood at the stove, frying slices of pork. She moved beside him like it was second nature, poured coffee into 2 tin mugs, and set one near his elbow. They didn't speak. Then she asked, What's my name to you? He set the fork down, turned slightly. Clara. No, she said, eyes on his. To other people. He looked at her a moment, then said, You're my wife. She studied his face, searching for hesitation. There was none. And not just for show? She asked. He shook his head. I said it because it's true. You stay. You work. You live here. You wake in my bed. That's more marriage than I've seen in most places. She smiled faintly and turned back to the stove, flipping the pork. You didn't even ask. I figured you'd be left by now if you didn't want it. That was the truth, and she respected it more than any ring. That afternoon, Elias hitched the wagon to ride into town with goods to trade, eggs, some jerky, a bag of wool from an old neighbor up the ridge. Clara rode with him, seated beside him in her now fully restored dress and a shawl he bought on a whim the last time they were in town. She hadn't asked for it, and he hadn't explained, but she'd worn it nearly every day since. As they passed into the center of town, people glanced their way again. Not like before. There was less whispering now, less smirking, a quiet acknowledgement. At the general store, Elias paid in coin. When the clerk asked what name to write for the record, Elias answered without pause. Boone, Clara Boone. The man looked at her, then nodded and scribbled it down. No one laughed. No one objected. Clara stood beside Elias and said nothing, but the slight tightening around her eyes gave her away. That moment, that answer, meant more than a church ceremony ever could. They didn't stay long in town, just enough to get sugar, lye, flour, and lamp oil. Before they left, Elias paused at the counter and, after a moment of consideration, bought a simple band of silver from the case near the front. It wasn't expensive. It wasn't fancy, but it was solid. He didn't say anything when he handed it to Clara back on the wagon. He just placed it in her hand. "You don't need to wear it," he said. She turned the ring in her fingers, looking at its dull shine in the sunlight. "I want to." She slid it onto her finger, and he looked at her hand for a moment, just long enough for her to see him breathe differently. Then he picked up the reins, and they started back toward the ranch. That night, after supper, they sat on the porch as the sun dropped behind the far trees. The valley was quiet, except for the wind in the grass and the occasional call of a bird. Elias leaned back in the chair he'd carved years ago, and Clara sat beside him, legs curled up under her shawl. "You ever think about leaving?" he asked after a while. "I used to," she said. "Not anymore." "Why not?" She looked over at him. "Because here I get to be who I am, not what someone wants. And you stay. You don't run. You don't demand." He looked out at the land. "I ran once. I don't want to do it again." She reached out and placed her hand on his. Not tight, just enough to feel his warmth beneath her fingers. "Then don't," she said. "We'll stay." They sat like that until the light faded completely. And when they went inside that night and undressed slowly, naturally, without fear or urgency, Clara let her dress fall to the floor and stood bare in front of him. Not to tempt or perform, but simply to exist. Her body was curved, full, marked with old bruises, soft from labor. He reached for her without hesitation, kissing her forehead first, then her lips, then her shoulder. They made love again, quietly, with certainty, without the need to name anything. And when they slept deeply, because what they had now was theirs. No one had given it to them. No one could take it. It had been built slowly and painfully, and neither of them intended to leave it behind. By late spring, the ranch no longer felt like a place Clara had been brought to. It felt like a place she belonged. The land had bloomed in full. The grass reached past the horses' knees, wildflowers had taken hold in the corners of the field, and the air was warm enough in the afternoons to leave the windows open without a fire going. The creak of the screen door, the clink of tin mugs, the creak of Elias's boots on the porch, all of it formed the background noise of a life quietly lived. The old question, was she his property, his burden, his guest, no longer hung in the air. People had stopped asking. Town had stopped staring. She wasn't that girl from the auction anymore. She was Clara Boone, and now she said it without hesitating. That final thread of doubt had snapped the week the town council sent notice. Papers needed updating. Domestic contracts had to be officially resolved. Anyone brought in through auction had to be declared free, reassigned, or wed. Elias hadn't flinched when the envelope arrived. He handed her the paper and let her read it herself. "I'll sign what you want me to," he'd said. But Clara hadn't answered him right away. Instead, she stepped out onto the porch, arms folded across her chest, eyes scanning the ridge where the sun was setting behind the trees. It wasn't fear. It was thought. Later that night, over the last of the spring stew, she finally spoke. "We never said words." He looked at her, puzzled. "Not real ones," she added. "Not in front of anyone." Elias set his spoon down. "Do you need that?" Clara thought it over. "Not for me." She looked down at her hands, rough from washing, knuckles still healing from the splinters of fence work. "But if we don't say it," she continued, "then some fool keep thinking you bought me." Elias nodded slowly. He stood, walked to the corner drawer near the stove, pulled out the tin box with a ledger and coins. From it, he took a folded paper and set it on the table. "County marriage license, signed in full." "It's done," he said. "I filed it last time we were in town. Didn't want to force it on you unless you asked." Clara stared at the paper. Her chest went tight. Not from anger, not from surprise. From relief. "You did that without a skin," she said softly. "I figured you'd stay. I just didn't want you to feel like you owed me for it." She stood slowly, came to him, wrapped her arms around his middle. Her face pressed into his chest. "I don't owe you," she whispered. "I'm with you." He held her back, firm and steady. "I know." That week, they took the wagon into town again. This time not for feed or salt, but for a quiet meal at the back of the cafe and to collect the stamped record of their union. The clerk didn't ask questions. He handed over the form, ink still drying, and simply said, "Congratulations, Mr. and Mrs. Boone." No one laughed. No one stared. On the way out, Clara caught sight of her stepmother standing at the corner of the dry goods store. Still thin, still bitter. Alone. Her mouth opened, maybe to speak, maybe to spit something sharp, but Clara didn't slow. She looked her straight in the eye, then turned her head back toward Elias, who was already loading the wagon. That part of her life was closed now. It held no weight. That night, Clara placed the signed certificate inside the drawer next to the bed, underneath her folded shawl. And when Elias asked if she wanted to celebrate, she said only, "Let's wake up like always." That's enough for me. And it was. The days that followed were not perfect. There were fences to mend. A late frost killed 3 rows of squash. One of the horses came up lame. Clara burned her wrist on the oven. Elias caught a fever for 3 nights. But they didn't flinch. She sat at his bedside with cool cloths. He mended the broken rail without complaint. They kept each other upright in every way that mattered. One morning, as they sat on the porch drinking coffee, Clara turned to him and said, "I think I want to start planting up near the bluff. There's better soil. Might put in tomatoes." Elias sipped his coffee and nodded. "You name it, and we'll do it." She looked at him. "You mean that?" He met her eyes. "You named yourself the day you stayed." She set her mug down, stood, and walked toward the garden, her bare feet touching the wet grass, her hips swaying slightly beneath her worn dress. He watched her as she stepped into the morning light, hair catching the breeze. And he knew this was the rest of his life. Not loud, not grand, just steady, honest, earned. At noon, she returned with a basket of wild onions and kissed him without needing a reason. And later, when the town asked how Clara Dane became Clara Boone, Elias would only say this: "She came with nothing, but I didn't save her. She chose to stay, and she did, for good."